It was August of 2019. I remember because it was the first time I questioned reality itself. Kelly and I had been planning the RV trip for months. City life had worn us thin, and the idea of disappearing into the barren quiet of the Oklahoma Panhandle seemed like the reset we both needed. Just us, open skies, and miles of nothing. I wanted nothing more than silence. Be careful what you wish for. The RV park was little more than a gravel lot off Highway 412. A few other rigs were parked at a distance, their lights flickering in the gathering dusk. We didn't talk much that evening. I remember how the air felt. It hung heavy, too thick for a summer breeze. It wasn't the warmth that made me sweat. It was that feeling, you know? When something's watching. Just out of sight, Kelly was inside making dinner, humming some old tune, but I couldn't shake the sense that we weren't alone. I chalked it up to being tired and stepped back inside, locking the RV door behind me. As if that lock would have done anything. By the time the storm alert came through my phone, I could barely hear the rain outside. Tornado warning. Kelly glanced over my shoulder, reading the message with me. We need to move. Now. Her voice was sharp, pressing, but I just stood there, staring at the screen. I couldn't explain it, but something in me, something primal, said not to run. The map showed the storm was barreling straight for us, a crimson blotch devouring everything in its path. I could hear the wind screaming now, rocking the RV in uneven jerks. Kelly was throwing things into bags, ready to bolt, but I couldn't move. "Ethan! Let's go!" she shouted. And then it stopped. The wind, the rain, everything. 1 second the world was tearing itself apart. The next, nothing. No breeze. No rattle of rain against the windows. Kelly froze, half-zipped duffel bag in hand, staring at the sudden stillness. The only sound left was the soft hum of our refrigerator. I don't know how long we stood there. Maybe minutes, maybe hours. The sky outside was dark, but not with clouds. It was empty, blank. No stars, no moon. Just blackness pressing against the glass. I stepped outside. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I'd see the tornado in the distance, or feel the pressure drop. Instead, I found something far worse. A mile away, where the RV park's office should have been, there was nothing but torn earth, like something had reached down and scooped the land clean. I could see the trail, a narrow path of destruction cutting clean through the horizon, yet our RV sat untouched, like a toy forgotten by a careless child. Kelly stepped out behind me, clinging to my arm. I felt her trembling, but I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The lights from the other RVs were gone. The rigs were still there, but the people were missing. There were no signs of struggle. Doors hung open, camping chairs sat around extinguished fire pits. Everything looked left behind. A low, groaning noise echoed from somewhere distant. It didn't sound like wind. It sounded like something dragging across gravel, slow and deliberate. I turned to Kelly, ready to tell her we needed to leave. But the words died in my throat. She was staring past me, her face pale as bone. "There's someone standing by the fence," she whispered. I didn't want to look. I had to. Across the empty lot, by the rusted chain-link fence marking the edge of the property, stood a figure. Tall. Still. I could make out no features, just a silhouette darker than the night behind it. It didn't move. It didn't sway with the wind, because there was no wind. I grabbed Kelly's hand and pulled her inside. We locked the doors. I pulled the blinds, but the feeling didn't leave. It grew. Kelly sat by the window, peeking out through the crack between the blinds. She didn't say anything for a long time, neither did I, until she asked the question that still haunts me. "Ethan, when did the lights turn back on?" I looked around. The other RVs, dark minutes ago, were glowing softly, but not with the warm yellow of interior lamps. It was blue, faint and cold, like the glow of a television screen in an empty room. We didn't sleep that night. I don't think we ever saw the sun rise. By morning, the RV park looked normal again. The people returned, friendly and cheerful, as if they had been there all along. When I asked the park manager about the storm, he gave me a strange look and said there hadn't been any tornadoes in the area. No storms, no warnings. I showed him the alert on my phone, but the message was gone. Kelly refused to talk about it after that day. I never found out what I saw, or what saw me. But sometimes, when the night is too quiet, I swear I still hear that dragging sound in the distance. My name is Tom Wilkins. I have always had a fascination with the unexplained, though I never thought I'd find myself tangled in one of its dark threads. Years ago, I worked for a small publication in New England covering local history and folklore. It was during the time I stumbled across the story of Paula Jean Weldon. Or rather, it stumbled across me. I hadn't set out to investigate her disappearance. I was simply looking for material, an old legend, a ghost story, something that would fill my weekly column. But once I began digging into her case, it consumed me. There was something about her, about the way she vanished, that got under my skin. And by the time I set foot on the long trail in Vermont, retracing her steps, I was no longer just a curious journalist. I was something else, someone desperate to find answers, even if they meant confronting something I didn't understand. It was December 1st, 1946. Paula Jean Weldon, an 18-year-old sophomore at Bennington College, had decided to take a hike along the long trail. She was smart, driven, and fiercely independent, qualities I came to admire as I pored over old police reports and interviewed those who still remembered her. That Sunday afternoon, she left campus wearing a red jacket, jeans, and sneakers. It wasn't the kind of attire you'd expect for hiking in the Vermont wilderness in late autumn. But Paula wasn't known for backing down from a challenge. Witnesses saw her walking toward the trailhead. She seemed cheerful, carefree even. A local couple, the Rileys, claimed they had seen her a few miles into the trail. She'd asked them how far it went, and they told her about the summit up ahead. They were the last people to see her alive, or at all. When Paula didn't return to campus that evening, her roommates assumed she'd simply lost track of time. But when another night passed without a word, panic set in. Search parties combed the trail, helicopters scanned the dense forest from above, and bloodhounds were brought in to track her scent. Nothing. No footprints, no articles of clothing, no sign she'd ever been there beyond those brief sightings. Paula Weldon had vanished. It was this chilling void, the complete lack of answers, that drew me to the case. By the time I started my research in the late 1970s, her disappearance had become a cold case, relegated to history books and whispered rumors. Some believed she'd fallen victim to foul play. Others whispered about the supernatural, the so-called Bennington Triangle, where strange disappearances were said to happen. I didn't believe in any of that. Not at first. The Long Trail is one of the oldest hiking paths in the United States, winding through Vermont's Green Mountains for over 270 miles. I arrived in early December, the same time of year Paula disappeared. The weather was bitterly cold, and a thin layer of snow covered the ground. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes you feel like you're being watched. I retraced Paula's route, starting from the trailhead near Bennington. It wasn't long before I began to feel uneasy. It wasn't anything concrete, just a sense that I wasn't alone. The deeper I went into the woods, the stronger it grew. At first, I told myself it was just my imagination. After all, I had been reading about her disappearance for weeks, immersing myself in every detail. But when the sun began to set and the shadows grew longer, that feeling of unease became impossible to ignore. About 5 miles into the trail, I came across an old, dilapidated cabin. It wasn't on any map, and it didn't look like it had been used in decades. The door hung loosely on its hinges, and the windows were shattered, their jagged edges glinting in the fading light. I don't know why I went inside. Curiosity, maybe. Or something else. Something I couldn't quite name. The air inside was heavy, and the floorboards creaked under my weight. In one corner, I found an old rusted stove, and in another, a pile of rotting wood that might have once been a bed. And then I saw it. A flash of red, half buried under the debris. My heart stopped. I reached down and pulled it free. It was a piece of fabric, torn and faded, but unmistakably red. The same red as Paula's jacket. As I stood there, clutching that scrap of fabric, I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. There was a sound, faint, almost imperceptible, like the whisper of wind through the trees. But it wasn't the wind. It was a voice. I turned toward the doorway, expecting to see someone there. But there was no one. only the darkening forest and the faint rustle of leaves. I told myself I was imagining things. I shoved the fabric into my pocket and stepped outside, my breath fogging in the cold air. That's when I saw them shadows moving among the trees. They weren't shaped like animals or people. They were wrong, twisted, and they didn't move with the rhythm of the wind. I turned and ran, stumbling over roots and rocks, my flashlight bouncing wildly in the darkness. I didn't stop until I was back at my car, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. That night, I stayed at a small motel in town. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadows, heard the whispers. And then there were the dreams. In one, I was back on the trail, walking deeper and deeper into the woods. I could hear someone calling my name, their voice faint and desperate. "Tom, help me." I woke in a cold sweat, my hands trembling. But the worst part wasn't the dream itself. It was the feeling that it wasn't a dream at all. That somehow, Paula was out there calling for help. The next day, I went into town to talk to some of the locals. Most of them were tight-lipped, unwilling to discuss Paula's disappearance. But one man, an old-timer named Henry, agreed to speak with me. "She's not the only one, you know," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "People have been disappearing around here for years. It's the woods. They're different." "Different how?" I asked. He looked at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. Fear? Pity? "You shouldn't have gone out there," he said. "Sometimes the woods take people, and they don't give them back." Despite his warning, I couldn't stay away. Something about that fabric, those shadows, kept pulling me back. I returned to the trail, this time determined to find answers. I hiked further than before, deeper into the wilderness. The whispers started again, louder now, more insistent. I tried to ignore them, but they seemed to come from everywhere, surrounding me. And then I saw her. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. But as I got closer, I realized it was a woman, standing just off the trail. She was wearing a red jacket, her blonde hair glowing in the faint sunlight. "Paula," I whispered. She turned toward me, and my blood ran cold. Her eyes were empty, her face pale and gaunt. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. And then she was gone, disappearing into the shadows. I don't remember much about how I got out of the woods. Just flashes trees blurring past, the sound of my own ragged breathing, the whispers growing louder and louder. When I finally stumbled back to my car, I felt like it aged 10 years. I didn't go back to the long trail after that. I don't remember much about how I got out of the woods. Just flashes trees blurring past, the sound of my own ragged breathing, the whispers growing louder and louder. When I finally stumbled back to my car, I felt like it aged 10 years. I didn't go back to the long trail after that. I never found out what happened to Paula Jean Weldon. Maybe no one ever will. But I know one thing for sure. There's something in those woods, something dark and hungry. If you ever find yourself on the long trail, be careful. And if you hear someone calling your name, no matter how familiar it sounds, don't answer. It's strange how the most tranquil places can betray you. I'd always thought the desert, with its stillness and vastness, was a sanctuary. A place where you could breathe freely and let the world fade away. That was before Camp Verde. Before the night, everything I believed about solitude turned into something I could never explain, let alone forget. I parked my RV at a campsite tucked away from the main road. It wasn't an official site, just a quiet patch of earth by a creek that had long since dried up. The February air was cold and sharp, and the horizon stretched endlessly under a sky so clear it felt like you could fall into the stars. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. I spent the first few hours setting up. The silence out there wasn't just silence, it was oppressive. No distant hum of traffic, no rustling of leaves, no chirping crickets. Just the eerie, all-encompassing void of sound. It pressed down on me like an invisible weight. By the time I started a fire, the feeling had begun. At first, I dismissed it as paranoia. It's normal, I told myself, to feel a little on edge when you're miles away from anyone. But it wasn't just the usual unease that comes with isolation. This was sharper, deeper, a sensation that crawled under my skin and whispered that I wasn't alone. The first time I saw her, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. I had been staring into the fire, watching the flames dance and crackle, when something moved in the corner of my vision. I turned my head, expecting to see a branch swaying, or maybe a shadow cast by the firelight. Instead, I saw her. An old woman standing just beyond the firelight's reach. She was still, impossibly still, like a statue carved from shadow. Her face was pale, almost glowing, framed by thin, wispy hair that clung to her skull like cobwebs. She wore a long, dark dress that billowed slightly in the breeze I couldn't feel. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my attempt to sound steady. She didn't move. Didn't even flinch. I rose from my chair, the crunch of gravel under my boots sounding deafening in the silence. "Mom, are you lost? Do you need help?" Her head tilted slightly, just enough to make the gesture unnatural. Her eyes dark and empty fixed on me with an intensity that made my stomach churn. Then, as if someone had hit a switch, she was gone. Not gone as in she turned and walked away. Gone as in 1 second she was there, and the next she wasn't. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the spot where she had been. My mind raced with explanations, one of them satisfying. Maybe it was a trick of the light, a shadow from the fire playing with my eyes. Or maybe I had nodded off for a second and dreamed her. But, deep down, I knew better. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was tired, that the isolation was messing with my head. I doused the fire and climbed into the RV, locking the doors behind me. The inside felt small and claustrophobic, the walls closing in as I tried to convince myself I was safe. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the RV, every whisper of wind against the windows, made my heart race. Sometime after midnight, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling a loose piece of metal, but it wasn't random enough for that. The taps came in 3 step, tap, tap, followed by a pause. Then again tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the door. My breath caught in my throat as I sat up, straining to hear. Maybe it was an animal, I thought, though I didn't really believe it. I reached for my flashlight, gripping it tightly as I moved toward the door. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking. No answer. Just the tapping, summoning every ounce of courage I had. I unlocked the door and yanked it open, shining the flashlight into the darkness. No one was there. But the ground was different. Earlier, it had been smooth, undisturbed dirt. Now, it was covered in footprints. Bare footprints. I slammed the door shut and locked it again, my hands trembling. Something wasn't right. I could feel it in my bones. I sat there, flashlight clutched in one hand, a kitchen knife in the other, waiting for morning to come. But the night wasn't done with me yet. Around 3 a.m., the tapping started again. This time, it wasn't just at the door. It was at the windows too, soft, deliberate, coming from all sides of the RV. Tap, tap, tap. It was as if whoever or whatever it was wanted me to know I couldn't escape. I crouched on the floor, trying to stay out of sight, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. That's when I heard the whispering. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of my own panicked breathing. But it grew louder, clearer. A woman's voice, speaking words I couldn't understand. The tone wasn't angry or pleading, it was cold, detached, like someone reciting a list of facts. I clamped my hands over my ears, rocking back and forth, praying for it to stop. And then, it did. Silence. The kind of silence that's worse than noise because it feels like something is holding its breath, waiting. I don't know how long I stayed like that, curled up on the floor, too terrified to move. Eventually, the first rays of sunlight crept through the windows, chasing away the darkness. When I finally stepped outside, the footprints were everywhere, circling the RV in chaotic patterns. And on the window, scrawled in the condensation, was a single word. Mine. I didn't stay to pack. I didn't care about the campfire ring, the folding chair, or the food I'd left in the cooler. I got into the RV and drove, not stopping until I was miles away from Camp Verde. Even now, years later, I can't shake the memory. I've tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it was some elaborate prank or a vivid nightmare. But every time I close my eyes, I see her, standing there in the shadows, watching, waiting. And I know, deep down, that I will never truly be alone again. It was May 2021 when I decided to camp by Lake Mead. I don't know what drew me there, not really. Maybe it was the vague memory of a childhood trip, the image of the water shimmering in the desert heat, or the way it felt like the kind of place where the world couldn't touch you. But what I do know is that I wish I'd never gone. The RV rattled and groaned as I maneuvered it down the dirt path leading to the lake. The landscape around me was barren, almost hostile. Scraggly bushes and jagged rocks dotted the terrain, and the air felt heavier than it should have. It wasn't just the heat. It was something else. Something I couldn't quite place. Like a shadow looming just outside your peripheral vision. By the time I reached the lakeshore, the sun was already sinking behind the horizon, its red-orange light spilling across the water. The lake stretched out before me, impossibly vast, its surface unnaturally still. It wasn't peaceful. It was dead. The moment I stepped out of the RV, the silence hit me. Not the kind of quiet you would expect in a remote place, where you might hear the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustle of wind through the trees. No. This was a silence that pressed against you, that seemed to suck the sound out of the world. Even my own footsteps felt muffled as I walked to the water's edge. I stood there for a while, staring out at the lake. There wasn't a soul in sight. Not a single boat, no other campers, nothing. It didn't make sense. Lake Mead was supposed to be a popular spot, wasn't it? The thought flickered through my mind, but I brushed it off. Maybe it was just an off-season thing, I told myself. It was as I was heading back to the RV to set up camp that I saw him. A man, standing on the far side of the clearing, just where the dirt path disappeared into the shadows. He wore a tattered jacket and a wide-brimmed hat, the kind fishermen might wear to shield themselves from the sun. But his face was what caught my attention. Or rather, the lack of it. The light was fading fast, and his features were obscured, like they were wrapped in shadow. But his eyes seemed to gleam unnaturally, reflecting the dim light in a way that wasn't right. "Evenin'," he called out, his voice carrying across the clearing like a whisper that somehow felt louder than it should. I froze, a primal unease washing over me. I hadn't heard him approach. There was no crunch of gravel, no rustle of movement. He was just there. "Evening," I replied, forcing my voice to sound casual, though my throat felt dry. "You camping out here?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. "Yeah," I said. "Just for the weekend?" He nodded slowly, his head bobbing like it was on a loose hinge. "You fish?" "Sometimes," I said. He pointed a long, bony finger toward the water. "Good spot just past the bend there. Big ones." There was something off about the way he said it, like he was reciting lines in a play he didn't fully understand. I nodded, muttered a quick thanks, and turned back toward the RV. When I glanced over my shoulder, he was gone. Despite the unease gnawing at me, I decided to check out the spot he mentioned. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was the kind of curiosity that gets you killed in bad horror movies. Either way, I grabbed my gear and followed the shoreline toward the bend he'd pointed to. The path was narrow and uneven, the kind of trail that feels like it's been forgotten by time. The further I went, the darker it got, the moonlight barely piercing through the thickening shadows. When I finally reached the spot, I saw what he meant. The water here was deeper, darker, its surface like polished obsidian. I cast my line and waited, the silence around me feeling heavier with each passing minute. That's when I heard it. A faint splash, like something breaking the surface of the water. I squinted, peering out into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing, but then, movement. A ripple, subtle but deliberate, cutting through the still water. And then, I saw him, the fisherman, He was out there, standing waist-deep in the water, his wide-brimmed hat unmistakable. His head was tilted back, as if he were looking up at the sky, but there was something wrong with his posture. His shoulders were rigid, his arms hanging limply at his sides. "Hey!" I called out, my voice shaky. "You all right?" He didn't respond. I took a step closer, my boots sinking into the soft mud. "Hey!" I shouted again. And then he turned. But it wasn't a normal turn. His body twisted in a way that made my stomach look right. Like his spine was bending in directions it shouldn't. His head snapped toward me, and even from that distance I could see his eyes. They weren't reflecting the moonlight anymore. They were glowing. I don't remember running back to the RV. It's all a blur. Branches clawing at my arms, the ground slipping beneath my feet, the sound of my own ragged breathing drowning out everything else. When I finally slammed the door shut behind me, I locked it and collapsed against it, my heart hammering in my chest. The silence had returned, but it wasn't comforting. It was suffocating. I peered out the window, my eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of him. The clearing was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the RV, every whisper of wind against the metal shell, set my nerves on edge. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, but when I mustered the courage to look, there was nothing there. The next morning, I drove into the nearest town, desperate to shake the unease that clung to me. I stopped at a small diner, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone. Over a cup of bitter coffee, I mentioned the fisherman to the waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes. Her face paled. "Lake Mead's been closed for months," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean, closed?" I asked. "Since the accident," she said. "A boat capsized out there last year. They never found the guy who went missing. Fisherman named Paul wore a wide-brimmed hat, always fished the same spot near the bend." I felt the blood drain from my face. "What happened to him?" She shrugged, her expression grim. "Some say he drowned. Others say he's still out there, looking for someone to take his place." I didn't finish my coffee. I didn't even say goodbye. I just left. The image of the fisherman burned into my mind. I haven't been back to Lake Mead since. I sold the RV, moved to a different state, and tried to forget. But sometimes, late at night, I dream about the lake. In my dreams, I am back at the water's edge, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. And in the distance, I see him, standing waist-deep in the water, his glowing eyes locked onto mine. And then, I wake up, drenched in sweat, the sound of his voice echoing in my ears. "Good spot past the bend there. Big ones." And I know, deep down, that one day, I will hear that voice again. But next time, I won't wake up.